So our first speaker today, his name is David Mifsud. He's the senior herpetologist from the Herpetological Resource and Management. And he's going to be talking about the Michigan Herp HAT, H-A-T, a biological assessment tool for herp conservation and management. So welcome, David.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a new project that we have. I'd like to start by saying that this work is being funded through the Region 5 EPA. And Ellen and I discussed the slide. The first slide is very purposeful. The slide represents exactly what the herp habitat tool is supposed to be looking at. And it's evaluating a landscape, not just on the rarest species, such as the pitcher's thistle, but looking at a landscape from a greater context of also considering our most common species, such as the American toad. And when we think about conservation, when we think about landscape preservation, we need to also make sure we're considering our most common species as well as our rarest species to truly understand how to best pursue and move forward with conservation and restoration. Some of our partners, I'd like to recognize the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, or EAGLE. We were very fortunate to also get to work with Michigan Sea Grant, the Stewardship Network, the Michigan Amphibian and Reptile Technical Advisory Committee, the Michigan Herp Atlas, and of course, all the great folks that I get to work with here at HRM. So amphibians and reptiles occupy a mid-level position in food webs. They contribute to the biodiversity and overall ecological function within their habitats and have been recognized as important indicators of wetland health. Amphibians and reptiles are excellent environmental indicators due to their sensitivity to human disturbances, as well as their response to environmental change. This makes them ideal candidates to assess wetland functionality. Excuse me. In 2000, the Ohio EPA developed the Amphibian Index of Biological Integrity, or AMPHIBI. The goal of this program was to assess wetland conditions using amphibian inhabitants. This program had an emphasis on vernal pools and the associated amphibians within those systems. The Herp HAT, or the Herp Habitat Assessment Tool, is a pilot project to evaluate the effectiveness of an index of biological integrity for amphibians and reptiles in Michigan. Hereafter, we're going to refer to those as herpetofauna. This bioassessment tool will rank and prioritize habitats using the herpetofauna as a metric. The way this is being structured is it's going to be conducted in a rapid assessment framework with approximately 3 surveys per location. Sampling sites are prioritized based on the locations that have MIRAM data, which is the Michigan Rapid Assessment Method, current species ranges and overlapping ranges where we have strong biodiversity, and existing spatial data sets. The initial sampling results will be compared this season to the MIRAM data sets. We have several objectives within the herp habitat, or with the herp HAT, including developing a biotic metric for Michigan to evaluate the functional value of wetlands with an emphasis on the amphibians and reptile inhabitants. The target audience is a broad range, but primarily regulators, managers, natural resource professionals, both public and private, and land stewards, including private citizens. The tool itself is designed to quantify the function of an individual wetland. That said, this tool will quantitatively rank a habitat. It is not designed, though, to compare different wetland types. And this is important. 2 sites can receive the same score while fulfilling very different ecological functions. It is also not intended to measure the amount of disturbance a landscape has experienced. Again, this is important because, as those of us who work in this field know, you can have relatively disturbed sites and still have high biodiversity of amphibians and reptiles. And one of the reasons why several years ago this project was developed out of my concern for sites that were being destroyed or lost or restored that were perfectly functioning where we had high diversity of amphibians and reptiles. A total of 8 metrics were identified to be used to rank species coefficient of conservatism, or C-value. A coefficient of conservatism is a numerical index reflecting the quality of a native species of herpetofauna and their overall ecological value to a landscape. The 8 metrics were sent out to resource professionals, including the Amphibian and Reptile Technical Advisory Committee, to rank each species with a score of 1 to 10, 1 being the least sensitive, 10 being the highest sensitivity. The first metric we looked at was rarity. An example for that is the eastern Massasauga rattlesnake, which is federally threatened. We also evaluated fragmentation sensitivity. The example we used here, and Bruce will be talking about this species later, is a Blanding's turtle, which requires a mosaic of habitats, including ponds, fens, and prairies throughout its active season. We also evaluated whether a species is a generalist or a specialist. An example of that would be a four-toed salamander, which requires wet woodlands with nearby creeks or bogs. And the species also relies on sphagnum hummocks, where the females will guard the eggs until they hatch and deposit into the water. We also looked at fecundity and as a variable in determining the C value for each species. An example here is the mud puppy, which has a relatively low fecundity rate with only 18 to approximately 140 eggs laid per season. The females do guard those eggs as well. We also looked at life expectancy, which Jim's going to be talking about wood turtles, which can live over 70 years and take anywhere from 15 to 20 years just to reach sexual maturity. As Jim is going to mention, it's not that they can live that long, it's that it's necessary for them to live that long. So we evaluated and considered life expectancy as part of this as well. We also wanted to consider the probability of species detection. More cryptic species will receive a higher score for this category. The example for that would be Kirtland snakes. Required hydroperiod, species that require longer hydroperiods will receive a higher score. A couple examples of this would include species like the western lesser siren, which is a obligate aquatic species, or the eastern spiny softshell turtle, which is arguably our most aquatic species of turtle in Michigan. Next, we looked at the importance of fishless wetlands. Species that require fishless wetlands will receive a higher score. An example of this would be spotted salamanders. And the importance of this is to tie in the work that was done with the Ohio EPA amphibi, because we also want to consider and think about these small isolated wetlands, these vernal pools or ephemeral wetlands that typically are under 2 acres in size and often not meeting regulatory criteria. We want to make sure that we're considering the rarest species that occur within these landscapes and also consider the ecological value of these sites, which again, historically, we've worked on projects that we've seen several vernal pools lost due to the assumption that they have low ecological value because of comparison to something like an emergent marsh, which has much more biomass, but surprisingly, vernal pools can be incredibly biodiverse as well. The pooled values from the reviewers were calculated, and the resulting score represented the C score, or the C value, or the coefficient of conservatism. What I have here is showing the different amphibians, specifically frogs, and their relative scores. While we intended to develop this based on a 1 through 10 scoring, we found that we were unable to generate a 1 or a 10, which we'll talk about in a moment. The species that had the highest overall sensitivity and the highest coefficient of conservatism were the pickerel frog and the Blanchard's cricket frog. Species that had the lowest overall C value included the bullfrog, green frog, and American toad. This coincides quite well with the Ohio amphibi, where they found both green frogs and bullfrogs having relatively low overall C values. In that context, those looked particularly at the impact that they have on vernal pools. In this case, these are two very generalist species, along with American toads, which have a relatively short duration of the breeding cycle. Next, we looked at the salamanders and their coefficient of conservatism. And the highlight for this one is the marbled salamander, which has a C-value of 8, the highest for any of our salamanders, followed by 2 species that have very isolated geographic ranges in Michigan and are particularly habitat specialists, the northern dusky and the southern two-line. Our most generalist, which still isn't exactly a generalist species, is the redback salamander. One's gonna say, well, wait a minute, Dave, redback salamanders are not an aquatic species. What we looked at, because this is looking comprehensively at the herpetofaunal diversity as it relates to the wetland function is not simply dependent on the physical boundary of the wetland, but the overall landscape and how that watershed influences that particular wetland. As such, we are also looking at species that occur around and within the riparian zones of these wetlands, which redback salamanders certainly would be one of those species. Next, we looked at our turtle species. Similarly, the lowest overall C-value was assigned to the eastern snapping turtle, followed by the 2 painted turtle species we have in Michigan. Our most sensitive or highest C-value fell on the spotted turtle, which is certainly the most habitat specialist and also arguably our rarest species found in Michigan. And again, while both species of lizard are not aquatic species, they do occur within our riparian zones. They do occupy habitats adjacent to wetlands, and both of these species received a C-value of a 5. Lastly, we looked at the snake's coefficient of conservatism for them. The highest C scores fell on 4 different species. The copper-bellied water snake, hopefully this isn't an issue. The copper-bellied water snake, the eastern Massasauga rattlesnake, queen snake, and Kirtland snake. Again, we were very surprised that we did not have scores in the 10s or in the 1s for species. We did try to normalize our data with the intent of doing a greater spread. When we looked at that, the mid-range species didn't change much, but it over-exaggerated the lower values. We are still going to be evaluating some different options for that, but as of right now, we are taking what the scores were provided by resource professionals and moving forward with those. The lowest scores were assigned to the northern brown snake and the eastern garter snake. And for those who do field work, these are probably 2 of the most commonly observed species, not simply based off of detection, but the greatest range of habitats that both species occur in. So what are some of our next steps? So we will be finalizing the methodology over the next month or so. We are actively working on evaluating locations and developing the sites that we are going to be sampling during the 2021 field season. As part of that, as I mentioned, we are going to be looking at the various MIRAM data sets that are available, and as well as looking at the existing data sets. So we're having a 2-tiered approach on this. While the weather is still cold outside, despite the melting snow, we want to look at where we have existing data sets for a location and where we might be able to do a desktop analysis and do a comparison. The importance of this also is, in some cases, sites will not be able to be field assessed, and if we can use a desktop review methodology for resource professionals as a first flush, we would like to be able to do that as well. This summer, spring and summer, we are going to be testing out the pilot project. We have, as I mentioned, we're going to be looking at various locations, approximately 10 to 15 locations in the Lower Peninsula of Michigan for this project. During the fall, we are going to be reviewing the metrics. We're going to be revising and evaluating the scores assigned to each of the species and evaluate if any modifications need to be done with that, and look at the possibility of after the revisions, depending on the timing of the grant, we may try to get back out in the 2022 field season as well. As part of this, to make this effort a user-friendly and relatively painless process, we will also be creating a digital data collector app, most likely using Survey123. As part of that effort, we are going to figure out how we can integrate that information so that resource professionals, when they are out collecting the data, will also be able to submit observations that will feed into the Michigan Herp Atlas dataset, ultimately making this effort and the Herp Atlas more robust with additional observations, and overall allowing for the assessor to be able to have a quick reference and methodology to collect their data. Long term, once the project is completed, we want to develop training workshops to get the folks who are going to be using this tool trained in the basic understandings, as well as getting folks experience with understanding the habitats as well as the species that occur within Michigan, and with that, how to survey and detect these species. With that, I would like to say thank you to Ellen and the Pierce Cedar Creek Institute, as well as our partners and the HRM team for all of their help. I almost never go this short, so this offers an opportunity for discussion. I'm certainly happy to go back to some of the slides if someone had a particular question about that. Otherwise, we can take a few minutes.
Thank you, David. That was very informative. We do have a few questions, as well as I always have questions for you. But one of our questions that came in was, what is MIRAM?
I'm sorry, I thought I did say that. I know at one point it said my connection was a little patchy, and I apologize. I do live out in the country, and I'm not going to trade internet bandwidth for living in the country. MIRAM is the Michigan Rapid Assessment Method. It is the sampling methodology that the state of Michigan, EGLE, uses for evaluating wetland function and habitat value.
David, we had another question of, are you looking to broaden the scope of the database and include other states, or is this going to be mainly a Michigan-based data set?
For starters, we want to test this and pilot here in Michigan. The amphibi was cutting edge for its time. Now we're looking at 21 years ago. I was very fortunate to have a friend and colleague who brought me in shortly after they started that effort, where we then ultimately developed the salamander monitoring program for the city of Ann Arbor based off of that initial work from the Ohio EPA vernal pool programs. While we would like to see this implemented and tested in other states, there's always going to be logistical challenges. One thing that I did not mention when we were in the turtle portion is that we will also be looking, we also have ranked any of our non-native species. For right now, we have 2 species of frog that pop up seasonally in Michigan. One of which is the green tree frog, and the other is the Cuban tree frog. Both of those come to Michigan annually on houseplants and yard plants from southern states. As Jim Harding likes to say, they have a really nice summer, but they do not overwinter. I have never heard of an example, even in very urban areas, where either one of those species survives in winter. We still track those as part of the Herp Atlas. We also are tracking several species of pet trade turtles that are found in Michigan, particularly in urban areas. Yellow-bellied sliders, river cooters, and false map turtles. All three species show up periodically in Michigan and some of our larger park systems. Each one of those species is not receiving a negative score. They are simply receiving a score of 0. It's not counting against the biodiversity, but it's not counting for the biodiversity. And this is in part, particularly for those three species, we can't even get our native species of turtles to have a positive growth curve. We are at a deficit in species. In the areas that those three species tend to occur, they are in relatively urban landscapes and often are filling in niches where our native species just aren't as tolerant. They also are largely herbivorous species, and in some of our river systems like the Huron River and the Ann Arbor area, where we have issues with species like Eurasian milfoil, all three of those species will actively feed, well, not the false map turtle, the river cooter and the yellow-bellied sledder will actively feed on some of our non-native aquatic vegetation. So one can even argue that they may actually be helping to some degree control some of these species. But again, we don't have nearly enough individuals to call it problematic, but they're not certainly listed as a beneficial species.
Adam asks, one of the greatest limits to AMP-IBI is that it could only be used for fishless wetlands. Many wetlands that he sampled are dominated by fish species. And so he's asking, is this new IBI able to fairly evaluate the function of permanently flooded wetlands that contain predatory fish species?
So that is exactly what our objective is. Knowing the objective of Amphibi, they wanted to evaluate and consider and review those isolated ephemeral systems that largely are absent of fish. And I say largely absent because you do have species like mud minnow that are tolerant and can survive in small ephemeral wetlands. So it's not that they're completely always absent of fish, it's just you often have small numbers of fish species. With the Herp HAT, the goal is just that. Our objective is to create a framework that allows for any wetland system to be evaluated, whether it has fish or not. So one of the 8 metrics is whether the site supports or doesn't support fish within a particular wetland, but it's one of only 8 metrics that were finally evaluated. We started off somewhere around, I think, almost 18 metrics that we were considering based off of a rather extensive literature review. What could we look at? What variables should we consider based off of other IBIs, off of other assessment tools? And from that, we narrowed it down as many of them were grouped within these major categories. We were able to lump several things together. So yes, our objective is to be able to look at a broad range of wetland communities using this tool, in part because we looked at multiple metrics, not just fishless habitat as a single metric.
Awesome, David. Someone was asking, did you see any trends in scoring the various herps based on the research professional regions such as Southeast versus Southwest or North?
It was interesting to see how many people had very similar scores. And then even those that were outliers for one species are spot on for another. It often has to do with our own personal bias. Jim Harding and I had very similar scores, particularly for turtles. It might be the fact that I have had too many car rides with him, and so I've been biased by his experiences. One of the things that I really appreciate from the research professionals who evaluated the species, if a person did not have a level of expertise in a particular group or taxa, they omitted response. So we do have some cases where we might have fewer evaluations for turtles than salamanders or vice versa in a particular metric. And what I appreciate about that is we don't have people who are simply trying to guess what they think is the rarest species, what they think is the most common. They're using their background and expertise in helping to make those assessments. So a great example is Katie Greenwald, who is an absolute authority in salamanders. Her scoring, she weighted heavily on the salamanders, but openly admitted that she doesn't have nearly as much experience working with Michigan snake species. And so she did not provide scoring for the various snake species that we have in Michigan.
We have lots of questions about sites. So people asking, are you seeking sites for particular species or habitats? Are there any sites in Berry County? And someone asks, do small man-made backyard ponds play a valuable role in herp population security?
So those sound like two different questions. I want to get the small wetlands in a moment because I absolutely love that question. We are always interested in looking at sites. If folks have locations that they'd be interested in having us evaluate, or if they would also like to test the tool out as we're progressing, if they have a site that they would like us to try getting out to. Again, we're looking at 10 to 15 locations across the Lower Peninsula. So that is also driven in part by where MyRAM data is. So it's going to largely be coastal areas. But again, the tool's intention is to be able to evaluate any wetland. And again, having a few extra minutes and the ability to chat about this, when we first developed this tool, when I first came up with the concept of this, it's built on the idea of a floristic quality assessment, a ranking of the different botanical species that occur on a landscape, quantified, and then an overall score provided. And too often, a site that has a relatively degraded score is omitted from consideration for land preservation. It's omitted or it's actively sought after for restoration efforts. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Where it becomes problematic is we've worked on a project where we had eastern fox snakes, Butler's garter snakes, several species of frogs, a couple species of salamanders in southeast Michigan. And the resource managers pushed aggressively to do habitat restoration to restore Lake Plain Prairie on former old field habitats. In the resulting habitat took far longer than I think expected to meet their criteria. But in the process, for the years that we'd been going out there, subsequently for other work that we'd been doing, we were not seeing those same species anymore. And the avifauna was far less than we had encountered previously. So in some cases, or coastal habitats as it relates to mud puppies, a species that is perfectly content. Some of our ghetto herps are just quite content with a piece of concrete. It doesn't have to be beautiful, glacially deposited limestone. Repurposed limestone in the form of an aggregate flat surface that was put on a river or lake shoreline in eastern, along the Huron-Erie corridor, is still providing that same functional value for a salamander. And when we remove that, we're actually removing critical habitat. So when we're talking about people's backyards, a small pool, small pond that's created is absolutely important, especially as a stopover site for many species like frogs who are using multiple ponds in people's yards. In the Northeast, I've heard several accounts of where salamanders use people's backyard ponds, particularly eastern spotted newts, that you'll see them breeding in people's backyard ponds. I've created my own backyard pond on my property in hopes that we would have that. We have not had salamanders as of yet. We actually did some regrading this past fall in hopes of creating that habitat. But we have Blanding's turtles, painted turtles, great tree frogs, American toads, spring peepers, great tree frogs, and green frogs, all living and actively breeding at the site. We have young painted turtles. We have painted turtles that move across our property and nest. We have to just be mindful at nesting season to when people are driving in and out of the office. But we have several young painted turtles basking in these locations. So backyard habitats absolutely are important. And one of the things we'll also be doing this year is revising our best management practices manual, which I encourage folks to take a look at, where we talk about things like creating backyard habitats.
And I'm going to stop you there. I know you've got a lot more great information. I know we've got a lot more questions in the Q&A. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but I do want to encourage people. I will be sending out some follow-up information, but encourage people to check out your company as well as check out Herp Atlas, which is another thing I meant to mention earlier, but I will send that follow-up information to attendees tomorrow. So I apologize for cutting you off with all the questions, but we got to get on to our next talk. So thank you so much.
Thank you.